Well, great presentations. Just quick comments. I just realized by listening to the three cases, I do realize it's very difficult to generalize any pattern on the governance for nuclear safety and security. And I just guessing by listening to the presentations that there are very different stages, right? This last case in China, this is about the planning and designing, before the construction, and while in Japan, in France, the nuclear reactors, power plants are already there. So therefore, the governance process can be extremely different. So I think just by separating the different stages of the nuclear power plant issue, would be helpful for us to understand the issues and challenges and facing different stages, and in order to generalize. I just want to hear from the presenters what do you think about this issue. So that's what I learned from this presentation.
Do we have other? Yeah, Philip.
Sorry, Philip Andrews speaking from Singapore. Sort of parallel, sort of counterpoint to Chi is that if you look at Germany, they had activists at the time of operation. So you can bring in the activist groups in order to close down a whole industry. So on the one hand there are differences, on the other hand in extreme cases they can be similar.
Okay, other comments or questions? Yes. Please kindly introduce yourself.
Okay, so Artist Mori from Japan. Yes, so I heard the two presentations of Curie, France. I'm wondering if I know we can acknowledge some process, but what about the outcome of Curie? So it's good. So it's one thing to change the process by deliberating, but how about it's another thing to change the outcome and also impact to the future construction as well as the renovation or the reoperation.
Thank you very much for your talk, Julie from CDU. My question is just quite similar. Do you think this kind of groups, CLI or activists, can bring positive impact in nuclear industry in terms of innovation, restructuration, but positive impact economically speaking about nuclear industry?
Okay, so maybe we start with this first batch of questions. Maybe each of you can give us a reaction to these comments and suggestions. Maybe Daphne, you were the first to present.
For all the feedbacks and comments, I think we have been with this project for almost 2 years, and I still have many questions in my mind. This topic is very huge, very heavy, and as Professor Xie mentioned, is spanned across from the very beginning the need for nuclear as an energy option for a specific country. And at that very early stage of policy decision making, it already involved major governance challenges. And then as we move on, if a country make a decision on the nuclear choices, and then to decide to implement for the siting, and then finally to implementation, enforcement, and regulations. And then we are also concerned about not only nuclear reactors, we also concerned about how to deal with nuclear waste, and then to expand the lifespan of existing operating nuclear reactors. So it's a wide range of very big issues involved. So for our research team, we took the comparative perspective. So now in this occasion, we are all here in this conference, and we have post research meetings. And for sure, how to make sense from out of it from a comparative perspective and make some useful analysis would be one of the key questions that we'll try to address in the upcoming discussion. But I think what I can pick up from some of our discussion last night and also from the conference presentation just now is that the contextual features are very important, and then the how we deal with institutional legacies and how we can build up, and what are the areas that we can be innovative in institutional development would be one of the very important areas for us to think about as well. And then for other comments on the impacts on, for example, on the technological innovation of the nuclear industry. In our French case study, we did not pay much attention in that aspect up till now. But for sure, that would be a very important aspect for us to look up. But we have Didier here with us, so I'm sure that he can share with us some of his insight. But in our case study, we do find that the EDF, they did respond with a more inclusive way, how they see, how they react with other stakeholders, and then there are some real changes there.
Didier Kashmir, I'd like just to give an example of something that could be considered as a part answer to the question of the impact of the CLI on the operators on innovation. It's not the question of innovation for the future nuclear generation. It's a question of innovation for safe operation of existing plants. As we said, the CLI are related to existing connected to the grid plants. One example is in La Manche, the recommendation coming out from Professor Fauss. We have been working with him. He is part of your reference in your presentation, Daphne. He recommended through the CLI to EDF, the operator, to put the diesels for ultimate safe electricity in case of disruption of electricity up the cliff and not down the cliff. After the Fukushima accident, it seems to be quite obvious. But in the initial design, the ultimate backup diesel has been designed to be down, just nearby the sea. So the recommendation was considered quite positive by the safety authority and by the operator. And then it was implemented, and the ultimate diesel backup are now up the cliff. And this can be considered as a little innovative, because in any further new build that will occur, it will be the case. This will be general. So one interesting point is the question of standardization. EDF in France, even if there are 3 types of nuclear plants, always consider that standardization is a good point for safety. This can be controversial, but well, this is what is said. So when you have a recommendation coming from one local information committee in one specific facility, thanks to this standardization situation in France, it can consider that it will be at least regarded as possible recommendation for all the other plants. So this is a way to answer to the issue of how the impact can be included in the innovation for design and for safety. Not really for design, rather for safety of operation.
Okay, thank you very much, Didier. I'd like to hear Professor Shiroyama reaction,
including the response to the previous question, and
then we'll go back.
Yes, I understand that there are different type of situations, so it's very hard to generalize. I understand that's true. In my presentation, I mentioned that there is a difference between the operation or the waste management and the kind of the new siting issue. in the case of the safety operation or the waste management issue, including opposition group, they have to discuss something, They have to decide how to deal with that. So in the case of a Kashiwazaki case, I mentioned that even the opposition group is part of the kind of the grouping, just like a Kuri, which was informally set up in Kashiwazaki to discuss about operation of the the Kashiwazaki power plant. And also, similar situation seems to exist relating to the waste management issue in Japan. That's also the very big issue. So even the kind of the activist NGO also try to be part of the discussion, because anyway they have to think about the way how to dispose that. But sometimes those issues are sometimes cross-cut the border. For example, the waste management issue is very interesting in that respect. That concerning waste management issue, the opposition group can be part of that. But sometimes what happens is that now we agree with about the future place for the waste management, then we can discuss about the increasing of the nuclear policy again. I forgot the case. It might be the case of the maybe in the Sweden. I forgot, but in some country, once there is a discussion of the waste management, inclusive all the stakeholder, but then after that, the issue of the the opening of the nuclear option comes up again in case again the situation can be polarized. So even for the same issue, depending on how to set the process and how to frame the issue, the situation can be different. So maybe sometimes the border is not so clear as Philip said. In the context, maybe now the case in Japan is the operation issue. So we do not deal with the new construction issue, but still, it's a kind of the issue. We begin to discuss about the kind of the pro-nuclear and the anti-nuclear again. So even though it's an operation issue, but it has a character of the the siting issue to some extent under the current situation of Japan. And China is increasing the nuclear, that's true, but other developed countries also will face the similar issue because of the possible issue of the replacement. If we try to continue to use the nuclear as an at least bridging technology for another few decades, in case, including US, Europe, and Japan, we face the issue of the replacement issue. So we will do that or not. That's very critical for the potential future of the nuclear. In case it's not a newly built power plant, basically replacement, but still the nature of the discussion might be similar to the newly siting issue. So that might be the concrete issue maybe we will have to face in the future. The second is outcome issue. That's a very important question. That's very hard to respond to that. And so far as I heard from the stakeholder, it may have good effect and at least making the situation more transparent. In the case of Japan, many issues are dealt with in how to say the combined way, sometimes untransparent situation, including the public works issue and the safety operation issue and other issues at the same time. Sometimes it causes the kind of the deadlock, politically deadlock. So far as I heard from the case of France, this seems to be a good mechanism to differentiate the issue to some extent. How effective those are, we don't have the kind of the numerical data about that. But that's the kind of the impression I had through the discussion with the stakeholder. And relating to the impact to the innovation, maybe that is a kind of outcome, interaction between the involvement of the local stakeholder and also the internal dynamics of the utilities or the company itself. In some cases, the story I told you is that sometimes company people say that because of the necessity for getting agreement from the local community, they cannot even propose upgrading of the Fukushima first reactor's facilities. I'm not sure it's a real story or it's just a justification or the continuation. But if the company do not have the group pushing for that kind of the innovation, it's very hard to push the company just through the interaction. But when there is a different group in the company is also the organization, so that's possible. In case interaction with the outside group can be a good outside pressure for internal decision making in the company. Sometimes that works. the story I had relating to the Onagawa power plant in the Miyagi prefecture, it's north of the Fukushima. So that actually they cite the reactors and also pump at a higher level. So because of that, they can escape from the impact of tsunami. In case I heard that there is one member of the executive board and strongly, having that kind of the option in the company board among the company board member for supporting that kind of decision, the involving the local committee and try to say that this is the unique condition of this Onagawa because of the so many tsunami history. So that was a good justification for getting that kind of approval from the board member. The interesting thing is that they try to not to standardize the issue. The people in the Tohoku Electric Company say that they try to just localize the issue. This is because of the unique nature of this city, place. They would like to upgrade the height of the reactors and the emergency water valve. Because if they try to generalize that, they have to discuss with other companies, the Tohoku Electric Company and so on, and they might criticize that. So localization is a kind of strategy to upgrade, but I'm not sure. At the macro level, this is a good thing or bad thing. It's controversial, but that's one of the story I had.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to respond to the question about how the activists can contribute to innovation in terms of institutional innovation or on the organizational level institutions. I think surely the activists can have very positive contributions to those things. The real question, I think, is how they can contribute that. Since the activists, most of the activists, they are lay person. I think they have a different perspective and concerns with the technology experts. I mean, they can contribute with their experience and knowledge. As experience and rationality, that's quite different from the technology rationality and the technology technology rationality. We have a specific example for that is in Hong Kong. We have a Nuclear Safety Consultative Commission. That commission was built up at about 30 years ago for the Daya 1 nuclear base station. So since like that's truly institutional innovation in China. Since about 30 years ago, when the Daya 1 project under construction, there were huge different voices opposing opinions to the Daya 1 project, and responding to those dissidents, they established an organization like the Hong Kong Nuclear Safety Consulting. I can't remember actually the number of that organization, but how that model can be replicated to mainland China, that's a challenge. That's a big problem. I also think about the CLI model in France or in Japan, how this model can be transformed in China to adapt to China's particular the political institutions, the political backdrop, how to adapt it to China's situation. I think that's the big problem. Yeah, that's my.
Okay, we have time for another round of questions or comments. Yeah.
Mei Yu from HKBU. So when we talk about nuclear power plants construction or waste management, we can find some general standards. But when we talk about citizen engagement or stakeholders' participation, so what are the general standards there? So whether we have some criteria to assess the efficiency of civil citizen engagement. And then we can say whether France has a better one than probably Japan. And for example, for the China, mainland China case, it sounds like a very successful one. So why? What are the criteria there? And so I think if we can find an answer to this question, we can connect the different cases together. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Sarah Fuller from Macquarie University. 3 really interesting presentations, and for me what really came out was this relationship between politics and institutions, and you all talked to varying degrees about the role of politics and how that may or may not influence these broader institutions that we're talking about, and nuclear power is obviously an incredibly contested and political issue, but I wondered if you could reflect a bit more perhaps on some of the more everyday or micro politics in relation to becoming an activist or in relation to becoming a citizen scientist, and how that feeds into the broader political process in terms of managing tensions, really being part of this kind of idea of collective governance around nuclear energy.
Picking up on that, I'd like to older French colleagues to comment. From my reading of several months ago, back in the 70s, there was some real citizen science in France as leading nuclear scientists from the bottom up, as it were, who were trying to lead an anti-nuclear movement, or maybe it was in the 60s, but it didn't go, 70s, it didn't go very far. And then after Chernobyl, citizens got together to measure radiation, because the French government was saying there may be pollution 1 kilometer across the border in Germany, but there is none in France. But somehow the 70s movement really never got going, and I'm wondering if that feeds into what we're hearing from these people, which is if you don't have buy-in from the government, or you don't have a government-created institution, citizen support doesn't really, citizen movement against nuclear or against more rigorous governance actually doesn't go anywhere. So how important, and is it critical that the government set up formal organizations, or at least recognize from the very top informal organizations?
Other comments or questions? No, so, okay, maybe I'll let you, I invite you to get back to these answers.
Well, thanks for all these very challenging questions. I'll take the relatively easy one. Now, May, you asked a very great question on how we can measure or evaluate public engagement or public participations. In our research, we tried a couple of different ways to develop an evaluative framework of the French local information committee model. One framework that we're trying out is that we use the ladder of public engagement that start from direct top-down information provision, and then to consultation, and then to collaboration, partnerships, and then finally to empowerment. So this is one way that we can try to map what happened in France, in South Korea, and in China, and then see how differences in terms of the public engagement and the what actually happened. And then there is other frameworks as well that measure instrumental impact as well as substantive impact as well. So instrumental basically focus more on the actual direct policy impact, more emphasis on from the perspective of the policymakers or the project proponents. So after engaging the public or the local citizens, did the developers, the project proponents, or the policymakers, they gain more legitimacy of what they are doing. So on the other hand, at the other end is more substantive impacts. That means that whether that decision, whether to build this nuclear reactor, put it there, the siting decisions of it or other decisions, whether that decision, the quality of it is improved. Okay, so there are different frameworks. It has been a struggle because different framework, they have different emphasis, and then there are different aspects how we evaluate public engagement. So, but on the other hand, this is also one of the most interesting research areas that we found. So that definitely is one of the areas that we work hard on that. My guess is that that would be a multi-dimension framework that we'll be trying to develop for this project.
Yeah. One issue is how to assess the effectiveness of the stakeholder engagement. That's the very important question. And what I can say first is that, sometimes it's very hard to assess the outcome, effectiveness, outcome of what. That's one of the issues. The second best thing we can do usually might be the assessment of the nature of the process itself. What type of the stakeholder involved and how they are treated and so on. And of course, the final result will not be clear, but maybe the involving a different type of the stakeholder might be one of the things we have to think of, especially in the case of nuclear. The one case I'm involved in is the issue of the stakeholder involvement relating to the waste management issues. How to set a national agenda for that is one of the critical issues in the context of Japan now. And the one of the concrete issues seems to be that, it's relatively easy to bring the people relating to the government and the business, but we try to, how the agency try to reach out to the women or the younger generation and so on. So expanding the kind of the scope of the stakeholder to be reached itself might be one of the criteria, at least for the process assessment, process evaluation. And one of the difficulty, for example, thinking about the unique nature of the nuclear is that there are several attempts to set up a platform to discuss between the user and the supplier. It means that how to bring the user of the electricity in Tokyo area, have the dialogue with the people living in the rural area, which is where the nuclear power plant is located. Theoretically, that's very important, but it's very hard to organize actually. Just dealing with the people living around the sites. It's relatively easy, but as I mentioned in the presentation, what should be the range of the people to be involved itself is the issue. 50 kilometer or 30 kilometer or 100 kilometer can be an issue. But furthermore, how to involve the user in that process is somehow very important but very difficult. Sometimes the complaint we hear from people living in the siting area is that the real beneficiary of the nuclear power plant is the user and people living in the urban area, but they never show up. They never appreciate our effort. So maybe that kind of communication might be needed, thinking about the nature of the issue, but it's very difficult. That's the comment I can make. And the second point I'd like to respond is the importance of the kind of the bottom-up movement. That's also true in the context of Japan, and some of the nuclear engineers and scientists became activists, and they are leading the student movement and so on. So in that respect, they can be a source for the more bottom-up kind of the thing. But also, sometimes one of the big change for the last 10 or 15 years might be the participate in the kind of national level discussion, and sometimes, how to say, not compromising, but try to be a kind of the stakeholder in the process relating to, for example, the waste management issue. They even notice that already we have a waste, so we have to deal with that. That's the issue they have to think of. So sometimes they played a very important role for setting up that kind of the national agenda. And somehow, I don't know the reason, but there are many interesting types of nuclear scientists and engineers, sometimes working with the citizens, the opposition group, but sometimes they are agreeing with some part of the government policy, but not necessarily agreeing, maybe the elite opposition. And partly because we had the opposition party government when the nuclear accident happened, DPJ government, the Communist Party of Japan. One of the colleagues, he's the specialist engineer, nuclear engineer, but he is against nuclear reprocessing and the nuclear cycle. and also he is pro-nuclear disarmament people. Somehow he was hired certainly as the deputy chairman of the Nuclear Atomic Energy Commission. So that kind of thing happens. So that kind of chemistry plays some important role based on the kind of bottom-up movement also in the context of Japan.
I'd like to respond to Sarah's question. You mentioned that everyday politics, and I think that question also related to Philip's question is non-organization is to establish non-governmental organization is a must or not. I think that's two questions. Sarah's question, according to my understanding, is related to the discourse level, and Philip's question is maybe on the organizational level. But I think that's really a huge complexity with these questions. I think they are. I think of the macro politics, try to explain that phenomenon. Since when I do my field work, I do observe that the communicative conditions really was distorted by both groups. I mean, the nuclear corporations, and also distorted by the activist groups. For example, the nuclear power companies, corporations, they use lots of propaganda, and they have lots of resources to distort the reality. But the activists, they also try to reframe their message to sell their message to the public strategically. So that's really complex. The activists love to respond. They use the fear-arousing strategies, and the corporations, the powerful group, they do have lots of resources to do propaganda, and they present facts of supportive to their positions and views. So it's really complex. I think the solutions to there is no simple solutions to those questions, to those problems. But basically, macro politics or everyday politics is really important, I think.
Okay.
First, I would like to express my great appreciation of seeing some Japanese and Hong Kong people looking with so precise and informed to the French situation. So it's very, very exciting and very informative also, including for the criticism. No, what I wanted to quote, in fact, is that some time ago I had the opportunity to work for the International Atomic Energy Agency on the issue of stakeholders. And very briefly, if you take the standard words of the International Atomic Energy Agency, they say in some forum or lectures or conferences, so addressing to the professionals of nuclear, both operators, regulators, etc. Never think that you will be able to list or to choose stakeholders. They will choose by themselves. So I think this is interesting, because this means that you will never be able to decide as nuclear specialists or nuclear involved in the business. You will never be able to decide from where in the society will come a reaction or a criticism or even a positive support. It will come from somewhere in the society, but you will not be able to decide where. Stakeholders decide by themselves that they want to become stakeholders of the process. I think it's interesting because it's uncertainty, and this is basically natural in social science, I think.
Yeah, I may add a few comments. It's probably time to conclude, right? So I will just add a few comments and build up on what has just been said. I think what Didier said is particularly relevant to me as a political sociologist, I would say, because precisely the history of the anti-nuclear movement in Europe appeared as a challenge to a traditional top-down decision-making, which was not in line with the reality of society at the time when it was decided in the 1970s. In France, it was a very state-led decision made by the government in the traditional French style, and young people, students my age at the time, reacted rather strongly, basically to the decision style, maybe more than to the technology. And I think this became increasingly true, and in today's society, decision makers have to accept society as it is and expression as it is. A corollary to that is that maybe in this area it's particularly difficult, because it's not just about managing the technology. You also have some people who reject it, and radical opposition to the existence itself of the technology. Among the stakeholders, some groups will be on that line. They may be minorities, very tiny minorities, small minorities, sometimes able to build a majority and force the government to renounce to nuclear power. It happened in several European countries. But in any case, it's very likely that the discussion is going to be polarized and sometimes captured by radical views of the pros and cons. I want to say that in our discussion we tend to touch upon many issues, and I think we have to be rather specific on the on what we try to say and to distinguish, and particularly to sort out the differences between institutions and society. I think CLIs are a kind of institutional design to manage basically public relations in the localities where you have nuclear power plants, and they are very important, relatively efficient. They are very much related to information, so I accept that we use the term citizen science if we understand with maybe the meaning is that citizens are engaged in understanding, measuring, assessing the local risk, the local potential leakages, potential radiations, security measures, safety measures taken locally. But this is far from a scientific and global policy debate about should we have nuclear energy or not. This is another institutional settings. There are some countries use national referendum. In France, we have the Commission nationale du débat public, where we can have national debates organized about these issues. I think we had one, which turned to work not efficiently in France. But these are different institutional levels and institutional design. And the final remark or comment I want to make is that probably the existence of these social movements is very much related to the specificity of nuclear energy. It's the only energy where you have a social movement. You don't have a social movement anti-coal or anti-oil, or you don't have that, so not to that point. You have social interests vested in coal and oil and jobs, and you may, if you phase out coal mines, you will face coal workers unions. but not civil societies organized against the coal industry or against the oil industry. That is very rare. So these movements have been important in the history of social movements, in the making of the green parties, and sometimes they are, in relative decline because green parties are more influential more institutionally influential through their participation in government, and to a certain extent it was the case in France. But I think these movements are changing, because nowadays we see social mobilization around climate change. So they are not as strong as what you can see in the nuclear movement, but they are entirely different. They are positive mobilization. Most social movements are opposing, generally speaking. When we study social movements, it's easier to mobilize against than to mobilize for. And maybe these movements, social movements around energy, are transforming themselves from movements against nuclear into movements for energy transitions, and that may affect the types of social mobilizations and citizens-government relationships we will find.